Everybody, and James, thank you. That was a very inspiring start. I think if you see pictures of customers dancing in your stores, you know you've got a successful brand and a successful operation. I've never seen that before. So that was fantastic. We're going to kick off the day's panel discussions by trying to set the stage for the day. And we're going to do that by talking broadly about issues of diversity and inclusion, but we're also going to dive deeper on a couple of dimensions. One is the dimension of leadership and trying to understand are there particular issues that affect leaders who are part of the new majority. And the second way we're going to dive deeper, and this may be a little bit sensitive, so I'll ask for your patience, is to talk a little bit about the differences between different segments of the new majority. Are the issues and challenges and opportunities that are faced by African Americans the same as those faced by Hispanics or Asians, and is it even right to think of Asians, or Asia is a pretty big place, as I remember it. So those are the kind of issues that we're going to discuss. Fortunately, we have a panel that is incredibly qualified to discuss them. I'll go from my left. Tony Shih is president, and you all have their backgrounds, and so I'm only going to briefly introduce them. Tony is president and CEO of United Hospital Fund, which is an organization founded, over 100 years ago to help build a stronger healthcare system for New Yorkers. To his left is Henry Cisneros. He's currently the founder and chairman of CityView, which develops houses that ordinary people can afford, and he's the chair of Siebert, Cisneros, Shank, which is a Wall Street firm. Many of you remember him as the former Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. To his left is Subha Barry. She is the president of Working Mother Media, and I think most of us know that Working Mother Media has now established itself, among other things, as a pretty strong voice in the area of diversity and inclusion. And all the way at the other end is Byron Spruell. He's the president of league operations of the NBA. And so if you have any questions about the refereeing or complaints, he's responsible for many things, as I understand.
Not taking any of those today, John.
But one of them is the referees. I overheard him describing his role, so if you have any questions about that, he's the one to speak to during the break. Now, you all have an important role to play, and it's not in the last 5 minutes. So the way I'd like to lead this panel is we're going to start, and I'll have conversations with the panelists about the issues, but then I'm going to stop every 10 minutes or so, and I'm going to turn it over to you to ask one or two questions, and then we'll go back to the questions. I don't want to wait until the very end. So please start thinking now if you do have questions, and if you can target them to the topics that we're talking about in that segment, that would be great. I'll do my best to filter as best we can. Okay? Okay, let's start off. In our discussions last week, we talked a little bit about internal and external biases that people hold. Internal biases are biases maybe that we hold in ourselves, and external biases are what we think about other people. And there was a discussion about internal biases, about people, members of the new majority, having their own biases about themselves. And maybe that helps, but oftentimes it can be a challenge. So maybe I'll just sort of ask each of you to comment. I'll start with you, Tony. Is this something that you think is relevant, and maybe talk about how you think it might be relevant?
Sure. First, let me say it's an honor to be here, especially with my fellow panelists, and thank you, John, for the invitation. I think this issue of internal barriers to leadership is real. Of course, external and internal biases are related. So the more the external world does not afford leadership opportunities to minority candidates, the more this is internalized by minority candidates. So I see a level of self-doubt among minority candidates that is just not as prevalent among, let's say, a white candidate. Sometimes I feel that if minority candidates were ever in a recruiting situation and they saw how many white males raised their hands that were completely unqualified, they would feel better about it. But certainly it is a challenge that I see among the people I mentor in our community.
Henry?
Jonathan, I would say that I've watched over the course of my life the process of a kind of diminution of internal bias, and I think it's less now, and certainly less warranted now than ever before. As I say, I've seen it over my own life. In 1981, I was elected mayor of San Antonio and was touted as the first Hispanic mayor of a major American city. In San Antonio, I was 33 years of age, a university professor and Latino in a city that hadn't elected a Latino since the fall of the Alamo in 1836. The usual candidate for mayor was a 65-year-old male who had punched all the right points in the Chamber of Commerce and the business community. So it was a very different kind of animal. And I felt then that I needed to relate and generate confidence and prove myself within the context of that traditional model. And my first years, that's the way I governed. I noticed over the course of the years, and certainly see now, more assertiveness, more self-confidence, more sense of internal and justified pride among younger minorities that goes with the changes in the times. The demographics of the country have changed, and I think it's very clear that not only the minority community, but the majority community sees the implications of that change. And as I said in my remarks last night, we see what minority leaders can provide the society in terms of a better understanding of the marketplace and the consumer, a better understanding of the employee base. Brian, for example, heading basketball operations for the NBA in a workforce that is heavily African American, is an example of just understanding the reality of who your workforce is. So I think it is, first of all, less warranted, and I'm pleased to say that I see evidence in the younger people that they get it and they understand their place in a positive way, a higher place, a more justified place, and don't have to do through some of the machinations that I did back in 1981. Let me just close by saying this last Saturday in my hometown, my successor as mayor, J Castro, who's a lot younger, was 20 years later, and also Secretary of HUD, announced for President of the United States. I would have never had the thought that that was possible, and yet it's happening.
It's very interesting, and you bring up the difference between generations, age, and I think that may be a theme that we can come back to.
Well, it's evolution and change in the times matched to age.
Right.
Yeah.
Subha?
So I think about this on two levels. As a woman, women typically in the workforce often talk themselves out of stepping up to roles, taking promotions, taking job rotations that may take them to a new geography, new country, making up all of those barriers right within their head. So you talk about that internal bias that plays a role. Well, I can't do that because by the time I'll have a baby and it may be hard for me to move, et cetera, so I'm going to say no to that next job. So women tend to do that. Then you overlay on it cultural challenges. As an Indian woman, boy, I would be expected to be the primary caregiver for my child. If I were not to do that, I would be thought of as a not so good mother. So you have other cultural issues that creep in that then further complicate how this bias, internal bias, this messaging that's inside your head, the reel that rolls, talks to you and tells you about what it is that would be very difficult and you shouldn't do. And then you add to that the fact that you look up and there aren't any or very few role models that look like you in positions of great success. Or if there are so few and who talk a lot about the sacrifices they made. So that's one part of it. Then the other part I wanted to really talk about is the generational piece. And you know, as you have the younger generation come in, and one of the greatest examples I have is of a young person sitting at their desk, completely multitasking. I could be on Facebook here, I could be doing a presentation that I'm preparing for someone, I could be listening to music, and I'm doing 6 things at a time. And I was convinced, I'm a baby boomer, the end of the baby boomer generation, and I was convinced you could not do all those things together and do them well. So I said to this young person, I really have an issue with this. I need you to come and show me the work you've done, because I'm not sure that you're going to do your best work doing all these things together. And of course, this person was super confident and came and threw down the presentation she was preparing for me, and it was fantastic. It was better than what I could have put together myself. And it reminded me that maybe this generation really thinks, acts, behaves, their minds, brains work differently. And thankfully, soon they will be 75% of the workforce. So guess what? The people like me have to learn from them, as opposed to having this bias towards how work should get done and so on. And what I want to bring up is whether it's the internal messaging that I have within my head about my own role and myself, or it's about how others are going to act and behave. Both of those get modified only through experience. So the need for there to be more role models that look like me, that look like you, Byron, are the way to overcome that, to say it is possible. If one can do it, then two can. If two can do it, then four can, and so on and so forth. And with the generational thing, I've raised 2 millennials. So from that perspective, they have taught me enormously big lessons about how to learn to navigate and work with them.
Yeah, and I'll just take off from where Subha left off in terms of just having this, to cut through bias, I think you have to have this open-mindedness as well as awareness, self-awareness. So both the internal side and internal messaging, you have to have your own self-awareness about what you can achieve. But then as you're dealing with and having relationships with other folks that James perfectly set up, you have to allow them to be open-minded as well. And so that's sort of connection, that conversation that can happen as a result is the magic behind it. But let me just I'm going to tell a quick story because I know we got to move on to the next topic. But even as Henry set up, coming in as an African-American male from Deloitte into the NBA, you would think that that would be a great connection point, and it has been. I have great connections with a lot of our star players, even to the ones that just came through the league this past year. But at the same time, I'm a football guy. so I could be 6'5", African-American, look like I fit in, fairly slender now, but I used to be 50 pounds heavier, and I'm a football guy. And so how do I assimilate into a basketball culture, even though I love the game of basketball, when I'm been tagged and branded as a football guy? So it's just even those biases can, you just have to cut through and have the conversation. I understand the game. Yes, I understand football too, but it's worked out just to be able to assimilate as well as, be authentic at the same time.
Let's stay on this for one last moment and make it maybe a little bit personal. And I'll share something about myself. I can't recall a time when I thought I'm not good enough or I'm not able to do it. By the way, that was a false assertion. There were many times when I wasn't. And maybe it's just a complete lack of self-awareness. But I don't really recall a time with that type of bias against my capabilities. Would one of two of you, have any of you, it's interesting, you've all risen to levels of leadership where I guess we would all assume you've never felt that way either, but did you or not? Is it?
I think, of course, and I think it's natural if you're the first one. So I'm in an industry where it's very old organizations. My last 3 organizations were over 100 years old each. In the entire history of the organization, there has not been any person of color in the C-suite in any of those organizations. I was the first Asian American, but the first person of color. And when you're the first and you see no one else playing in that field, of course you're going to feel, do I really belong there? And when you get there, you feel that every single day because the people around you aren't like you. It's natural, you just have to be aware of it.
But
Sorry, Henry, go ahead. Yeah.
Go ahead,
Sounds like you
Brian,
all may want
please.
no, go ahead, Harry.
I'm a confident person, and I haven't had many instances where I didn't feel I could do it. But in the transition from public policy, I was a mayor, I was a cabinet officer, and then went and became president of a television network, and then later created my own companies in the real estate and infrastructure space. There was a sense that because you've come out of public policy, you must be more of a rainmaker than a substantive person in a technical and financial aspect. And there's just a general sense that, it can't be. You haven't been in the business side long enough. A lot of the skills from politics are necessary in business, gathering people together, setting deadlines, moving things forward. But the general sense, if you haven't mastered the technical things. So when I did get into a position where I had to pass a Series 7 in order to have a SEC license, I not only studied very hard and passed it, but I took 10 more exams over the span of several years, almost as a hobby, just to demonstrate the technical knowledge.
Well, I actually wanted to add the immigrant experience. I grew up in India as part of the majority population. So I look around me, most people look like me. I looked at the billboards, they look like me. People in the movies, they look like me. So, CEOs, they look like me. So when I came to this country, I really didn't know how to act as a minority. And when I was treated as a minority, I looked at people like, what's wrong with you? Why would you correct my accent? Why would you, my name is Subha, 2 syllables, Subha. They called me Sue. Like, how crazy is that? But what happens is, over a course of time, you start to say to yourself, well, maybe to relate to them, I need to refer to myself as Sue. So my first job out of college was trading commodities. And they were agnostic. They didn't care, male, female, young, old, immigrant, non-immigrant. As long as you put the money on the board, you were gold. And if you weren't, you were dog shit. So it didn't matter. But it wasn't until I was at Merrill in a sales role as a wealth advisor that relating to people, people, if they didn't understand your accent, would hang up the phone. So you started to change yourself to be the person that they may want you to be, but you weren't being your authentic self. So I would say to you, how do you create this sense of swagger that most immigrants will come in with, that they lose once they come here? And I will speak about, somebody like myself who was educated, who learned to speak English, yes, with an accent, but who came in and lost that and had to find that over again.
The last point I'll make is, and it goes back to your earlier point, Subha, around experience, because at the beginning I felt much like Tony, in the beginning of my career journey, if you will, where there's a little bit of self-doubt. Do you fit? Do you belong? But as you get more experience, you absolutely belong, and you almost turn into a superpower, if you will, because you understand the matrix better, and you've been educated upon it. You understand the matrix, yet you bring a different perspective than most people that have been in the matrix. So you then sort of flip that discomfort into a superpower, frankly. And I hope you all can understand what I'm saying there. But as experience goes and as exposure goes, et cetera, you can't do it by yourself. But once that flips, turn it into a superpower.
It was James's point about liabilities becoming assets.
Yes, absolutely.
All right, are there, let's pause briefly on this. And any questions for the panelists? Well, have we shocked you into submission? Yes, the gentleman over there. Please, could you just say who you are first, and then
Derek Dingle, Black Enterprise. It's a great discussion. Question that I have is, you talked about the new generation, millennial generation. Now we're seeing the Generation Z come up. They have a different focus, especially in terms of technical agility and confidence. But one of the challenges that corporate America is facing, and we've done studies on this, is retention. So as you have this new group of people of color and women come in there who see the barriers, see the lack of diversity, how do corporations figure out a way to retain this talent so that you will eventually have diversity at the top?
Someone want to start with that? Subha, go ahead.
I'd like to take that. The reality is that they observe and notice that lack of diversity. But there's one more element that these millennials are looking for that I think corporations can absolutely sign on to and commit to, and that is the sense of purpose and value. They do look for that connection in the company they work for to some sort of purpose and value, whether it is a connection to the community, because if you take financial services as an example, which is the industry that I grew up in, you may not directly see the connection to underserved communities, but companies are beginning to commit to that. So if you're able to show them that connection to that purpose and value, you have an opportunity to help retain them. Secondly, we always used to think this notion of flexible work, flexibility in terms of how work gets done, is something that working mothers wanted, which is really the premise 33 years ago when we started with the 100 best companies for working mothers. That was the purpose behind that list. But You know, if you look at this generation, they want flexibility for a variety of different reasons. I have passion and commitment for, you know, rock climbing, so I'm going to be taking time off to go do that, or whatever it is. The ability to understand that working flexibly is something that every employee now wants and seeks, and it's actually a great value proposition for your company. Makes it easy for you to find some other things that you can provide to these millennials that can help support them till such time as you're able to get enough diversity into your senior leadership roles.
Tony, you talked earlier about recruiting. Do you have a thought perhaps about retention as well?
No, yeah, I mean, I think the organization has to truly believe that diversity is a strength of the organization and not something that they're just doing just to hit some quota because it's the political right thing to do. And new recruits can sense that, you know, whether or not they feel that they're adding value because of their diversity to the organization. I also want to echo something that Subha said, which is this new generation, especially from communities of color, really value organizations that have a social mission to give back to the communities. And I think that in and of itself is a great tool to retain candidates.
And I would just quickly say that I think the story that James Reed told us earlier, including the very evocative tapes that he showed us, demonstrate a lot of what has just been said, how to pull people together around cause, mission, belonging, or treating people as people. Very, very impressive, James.
But a lot of times it starts at the top, as James certainly identified.
Correct.
Certainly with Adam Silver, you know, hopefully you
Absolutely.
connect with the way he has led and the values and purpose that we talk about it from an NBA brand perspective. But then it has to filter throughout the organization. You got to find ways, Derek, to really allow the organization to own inspiration of people and the cause and the mission of the organization. And that's how I think you really connect overall.
In summary, Jonathan, if you treat people decently like people and address them from a perspective that is humane and sincere and honest, I think it helps a great deal, as opposed to treating people like, you know, just
Assets.
elements, cogs and assets of the organization.
You're really making a connection here between, you're really broadening the topic of diversity, in effect, to making it a topic about people, in effect, in some ways. And I'm not trying to diminish the specific aspects of diversity and inclusion, but you're talking about an even broader set of behaviors, which I think is quite interesting. All right,
Well, and if I may just add quickly, it's possible, now this may be just a bit of a stretch, but it's possible that diverse leadership, people coming from diverse communities, bring just a little bit different sense than the traditional American business outlook because of where they have come from, because of their journey, because of their families, because of their connections to real people, et cetera, in communities where striving and struggle has been the culture that may make a difference in corporate life.
Right, I think that was a point earlier that you're amplifying that Byron made, and I can, again, as a white male, I can tell you that I think that's exactly right. I'm constantly discovering those sensitivities that are, I mean, we probably don't have time to talk about unconscious bias, but I'm the poster child for that, as I don't, you know, it's not easy, for me at least, and maybe there are many others who feel this way too, who to sort of see the kinds of things, Subha, that you were talking about people correcting your parents' pronunciation or your pronunciation. You said that before we started, until you say it. And that's sort of, so I think that, Henry, you're exactly right. Those experiences that members of the new majority have to strengthen, have to in some way strengthen your ability to relate to people and to therefore build more diverse and inclusive organizations.
But for the new majority leaders themselves, it creates certain conundrums. They're living in multiple worlds. They're the bridge, and sometimes the bridge can't hold that much weight. It's just too much weight to ask. But people who have their foot in two different worlds are expected to behave by a certain number of certain kinds of norms in the business setting, pure rationality, and then go home and see the reality of a family that's living.
Yeah, I'm not trying to make it sound easy. Yeah, I'm just trying to draw the distinctions that you're highlighting. It's very interesting. Okay, one more question and then we'll move on. Yes, the gentleman here. So I'm calling on men now, but I don't see. The next time I'll call on women.
Thank you. My name is Camilo Romero. I work at Macy's on diversity and inclusion strategies. Again, thank you guys so much for all the insights that you're sharing with us. And I definitely see there's a common thread amongst what you guys are talking about when it comes to confidence, when it comes to turning the discomfort into a superpower, and the immigration confidence. Have you at any point had to deal with maybe coming off as overly confident because whether it was your experience or generationally?
Great question. Anyone want to take that?
Well, I'll take that. What's interesting is, there are lots of generalizations that are made about different communities. And I used to always think to myself that Asia is such a big continent that the difference between East Asian and South Asian, I'm from India, is different. And so, for example, many of us who come here grow up with a certain facility around English because we have learned, because the British ruled us for a good long while, English is something that we've learned in school coming up. As compared to many of our Chinese colleagues who, in my generation, at the same time those students were coming over, did not. And something that they used to do that was amazing was that they collaborated when they studied because it was so hard for them to read all the material, to transcribe, translate it, come up with the ways in which to present that in class. They studied in groups. None of the other Indians ever got together to study. We didn't collaborate on it. We each wanted to make sure that we would seem and sound better than the next. So I always used to wonder, and I actually talked to some of my Chinese colleagues about why they studied in groups. And I asked my Indian colleagues about why they didn't. And it was interesting because part of it comes from a sense of, I need to be able to be confident, present myself forcefully, be heard, and I can't do that collaboratively because what if I give away an idea to that other person and that other person picks it up and presents it better than me? I'm talking about in student life, but that translates into the workforce too. And you see how communities of color either collaborate or don't collaborate. And I will speak for my own community. Very often, you don't want to be seen as promoting another Indian because, oh my God, that would seem like nepotism. Is that really the truth? Or is it rather, I want to be the shiniest penny in this bunch? So I think that acknowledging some of those things is really important, and that can come across as confidence. But what it really is an insecurity underneath that among a billion people, you somehow want to be able to stick up and be seen and noticed. How do I get noticed? And not understanding that being able to collaborate and share, a rising tide will carry all boats up. And if you are the best among them, you will step up even further. I think understanding that is something that communities need to do and need to do better.
I would just say that I have not suffered from the problem of overconfidence because I am not overconfident. I mean, I've spoken, I suppose, thousands and thousands of times, and I'm nervous before every single one because I think this may be the one that I just flat blow. And similarly in presentations and many other sort of settings. Now, I don't want to be, dealing with stereotypes, but I think many Latinos feel that we're brought up in a culture that encourages a certain kind of humility. Many are Catholic, and there's a sense of the collective as opposed to the individual. So those things that are cultural play in even after a 40-year career and mitigate the sort of overconfidence. There's still a sense of breaking through and trying to please the larger society. I think, as I said earlier, it may be generational in that that's what I grew up with. Some of the later generation, I think, starts with greater confidence. A lot of paths have been broken, a lot of platforms have been built, and that's the way it should progress in society.
But just one more point here, because there's a fine line, because Subha and I, you and I were talking about it at breakfast, in terms of you don't want to come across overconfident or arrogant, but you definitely want to have that level of confidence that's just butting up against it, where you still have some swagger about you too. That's okay. That's okay. You don't want to necessarily lose your swagger or whatever, however people want to describe it, but that level of confidence is truly important to make it through these journeys. No question about it.
I think we have a tendency to err on the other side, to be overly humble, and I think that's damaging. I wouldn't worry about being overconfident because your critics and your competitors will always cut you down to size. But no one is going to lift you up if you're underconfident. So I would err on the side of overconfidence if you're going to err on others.
All right, that's very, very interesting advice. Okay, let's change the subject a bit to talk more about leadership. And now each of you have risen to a level of leadership in your respective fields. And so this may not apply to you personally today. If it does, feel free to say so. But how would you, or what are the kind of traits, I guess, that you would look for in emerging leaders from the new majority? And what advice, what type of advice would you, well, we'll come to the advice at the end. How do you think about when you see younger, more junior people, typically younger, who are not yet in positions of leadership, they're members of the new majority, whatever their backgrounds. You must see something of yourself in them. How do you, what are the kind of traits that you look for in those people that would help them get to where you've gotten to?
Yeah, two words come to mind for me. It's adaptability and then innovation. Innovation, people overuse it today in terms of organizations, but I say from the self point of reinventing yourself and always thinking about how your skills and abilities and capabilities, competencies can evolve with an organization or a new opportunity. And I think that adaptability as well as innovation, being able to reinvent yourself is really key to being successful in your journeys as you talk, kind of going forward, social media, technology, et cetera. Just being able to evolve yourself in a way that's meaningful and influential.
Is there something about, say, minority business people, say, entering the workforce that gives them a disadvantage or an advantage in that regard? Are they different, or is that
I just think
particularly
this,
important?
from a millennial standpoint, even minority standpoint, just the access and the immediacy of everything today, where innovation is key overall, but being able to utilize technology and other things to really advance yourself, you can really do a lot of easy things there and help or allow people to help you along that journey as well. I just think it's something that's so immediate right now that you have to take hold of reinventing yourself all the time. Subha?
So I would look for things like critical thinking skills and the ability to ideate and formulate that idea and shape it, and the confidence to be able to share that. And paired up with that, the humility and the ability to include others' ideas and thoughts into it. So putting those two things together, you've got to have sort of a straw man poll. You have to come up with some idea and be able to present it well. For that, you need to have thought through it. You need to figure out who the audience is, who's receiving it, and you present it. Then you have to be open-minded enough to be able to welcome other people's input into it, and humble enough to know that if there are interesting, important variations to your thought, that you incorporate that into the idea, where you don't need to have it be your idea that wins every time. Those are the traits I look for.
The best advice I ever heard on this was from Warren Buffett, who said, when I interview people, I look for intelligence, I look for energy, and I look for integrity. And of the three, integrity is the most important, because without integrity, the other two can destroy a company. Now, integrity, in my view, should be writ large. It means the kind of broad sense of humanity. It means an understanding of people, a certain kind of empathy and empathetic capabilities. It means certainly adherence to values, the kind of humility that Subha just referred to. So I think that's as usual, Warren Buffett's pretty close to right.
So when I mentor Asian American professionals in particular, I focus on emotional intelligence. And the reason I do that is I back up and I think about the stereotypes that people have about East Asians. And there is a prevalent stereotype that East Asian Americans are very technically competent, but don't have the soft leadership skills needed to rise to leadership levels, which is why, in my field, health and medicine, we have a lot of Asian physicians, but very few in leadership. Same thing in Silicon Valley, a lot of Asian programmers and technical people, but not very many managers and leaders. And so, because of stereotypes for the East Asian Americans, again, that we're technically competent but don't have the soft skills. And so I asked them to focus on emotional intelligence, things like self-awareness, self-regulation, motivation beyond status and money, empathy, social skills, et cetera. Because those things you need to focus on because you need to counter the stereotypes that people have of you. And I think that's really important, especially for Asian Americans, to rise among the leadership ranks.
It's important for everybody, obviously, but you're pointing out the particular importance for someone who has to deal with the kind of issues. Well, let's talk about stereotypes for a minute. And again, this may be, a sensitive, somewhat sensitive topic, I don't know, but you're each members of the new majority by the conference's definition, but you each come from different backgrounds. Are there different stereotypes, and do you what are the different stereotypes? Tony, you talked about Asians being sort of, engineering capable, but maybe less people capable of putting words in your mouth. Well, is that how you would, why don't you maybe just kick that off and explain a little bit more and then go down?
Sure, I mean, that's just one stereotype, but I also don't want to lump all Asians together, which is something that Subha points out, obviously, but the Asians is such a heterogeneous group, so even this model minority myth, it's a myth, of course, because there's so different subpopulations of Asians. In fact, you have some Asian communities that are high poverty, low education, very contrary to the myth. And so I think the key is to understanding the stereotypes so you can actively work against them.
Latinos are a big group, 55 million people in the last census, growing to 100 million people, or a quarter of the country, by about 2040. But within that are Latinos born in the United States, particularly 70% of which are Mexican Americans, and thought of as poor, and thought of as addressed in the educational system. But then there's Cubans who have come from the island in many cases, much more confident because they were in leadership positions on the islands, and the most assertive, if you will, at least that's a stereotype, among the Latino groups. Puerto Ricans, some born in Puerto Rico, some New Yorkers, and others across the country, people who come from Central America, people who come from Venezuela and Colombia and Chile and more from South America now, many of whom are professionals and came here to go to school, stayed here, others fleeing circumstances there, but among the professional class. So it's a tremendous mix, and sometimes I think people say, well, we hired a Colombian doctor or a Chilean physicist in our university, and that's representative of Latinos. Well, not exactly. And then there's the Mexican American population that are thought of as the people who do the yards and do the custodial work and car mechanics and women working and cleaning homes. But we have great talent, cabinet officers and senators and such now as well. So it's hard to really sort of fix any easy definition of the population except to say that this is of importance to the country at large when it's going to be a quarter of the population. And the better we focus on educating that population, the better it is for the country. That population has now gotten sizable enough that its numbers, educational, compensation, income, wealth, will move the needle for the United States.
So I would say to you, as speaking as a South Asian, an Asian of Indian origin, that it took me a while to recognize that it wasn't my accent that was derailing me or causing for people not to understand me. It was the speed at which I spoke. So the first thing I learned, and I had to pace myself. So I used to tape myself. When I was at Merrill Lynch, I used to tape my presentations. I used to listen to myself and then sort of redo them. It was learn and redo them. And what I realized was, with that accent, if I spoke slower, people understood me. because I entered a room or I entered a call with the advantage that because I was of Asian or South Asian origin, they assumed I was smart, that I was good with money and numbers, till I proved them otherwise. So the reality was you were given certain benefits of the doubt that other communities do not often get.
The accent actually helps. The British accent actually.
Well, I didn't have a British accent. I had an Indian accent, which, you know, remember, when I came in here, the typical Indian model was Apu at 7-Eleven somewhere. They weren't really thinking about all the pish-posh Indians who are on TV now. So it was a very different role model. But what I will tell you is having the EQ, knowing how to read a room, knowing how to understand you know, how to align or ally yourself with where the power was in a setting. Those are the sort of, so you talk about soft skills, there's part of that is about presentations and things like that, but the other part is also about having that judgment. There's nobody to teach you how to do that. And you may say, well, how does a white guy know that? But you know, they get taught because they would make a mistake and on their way to the bathroom after the meeting, somebody would just kind of slap them on the side of their heads and tell them, that was stupid, why'd you do that? You know, here's a different way to do it. There's nobody to tell me that. So part of that is what undermines many of these communities in terms of they're usually only one of them in the room like them, and there is really nobody to tell them in time what they have to do to change. And I'm going to give you one little example of an individual at a company, amazingly competent, technical man. He was in the IT area, and he was an Indian man who came to me when I was in a role in that company and said to me, you know, I'm really great, I get great reviews, but I never get promoted, and I think it's because of my accent. He comes from a state in India called Andhra Pradesh, where they have a very pronounced, typical accent. If there's anybody from that state, you'll know what I'm talking about. And I told him, you know, your consciousness, being that conscious, means that you want to do something about it. So what do you do? How do you improve that? Have you gone to classes or a course that allows you to help mitigate that? And he said, no, I haven't. I said, you know, you have children at home, young children. Do you read to them? He goes, well, sometimes, but they don't usually understand me. So I said to him, allow them to be your teachers. Take a simple book and read to them. He says, I read all the time. I said, but you don't read aloud. And I said, every night for the next month, you have to read to your child. Read and allow them to correct how you're pronouncing something. Tell them that daddy needs their help. And bring them into it. So 6 months into it, his accent has improved. And a year and a half later, he got promoted. It was not about his accent changing. It was about the story inside his mind that changed. Where he, again, began to acknowledge the fact that if his child could understand him and he was improving, that he was doing so at work. And I'm going to guarantee you it had to do with confidence and not his accent.
So,
I don't know if you want to talk about being black or being a football player.
well, I'm going to combine the two, believe it or not. And so a lot of themes here in terms of the lack of technical skills, stereotype, the lack of emotional intelligence, etc. So those were all common themes. But John, I can't believe you asked that question. So, 6'5", African-American male, football, the angry man syndrome. If I raise voice, if I demonstrative with hands, those are things I have to just not guard myself against because you still want to be authentic, but you can see people do that if and when I do what I just did. So you just have to be conscious of it. Did I have that?
We're far away.
Yeah, far enough away, right? But no, seriously, that is something that is a stereotype of African American males, particularly if you've got a little bit of frame on it.
Yeah. So, you know, authenticity is another topic. We're going to run out of time, but authenticity, and Henry, I think you said having feet in two camps, like during the day and at night, perhaps you mentioned it, is a very complicated challenge, I think, that members of the new majority face. Again, we may be able to come back to. I'm not sure if we'll have time. Let me just pause again and turn to the audience for questions. Any questions that someone have? Yes, the young woman here. Yes. Oh, you should have a microphone here.
Coming.
Oh, microphone is coming.
Thank you. My name is Crystal Ward. I work for Citibank. So just had a question. As we're talking about diversity, I've attended several diversity forums, and also I'm the co-chair for the Black Heritage Network at Citibank. And in talking about diversity, we often hear people share about what the diverse candidates can do to become better. You spoke about emotional intelligence, about various things, but I think there's an element of ownership on leadership. It's like if you're playing a chess game, there comes a point where somebody has to deliberately and intentionally decide to move that chess piece. So my question to you as leaders, what have you done to move the dial in your respective organizations? And what advice would you give for individuals on how to hold leadership accountable? Because for me, I'm in a sales role. If my sales numbers look the same way for 2 or 3 years, we all know what would happen. So when you think about the diversity numbers not moving, 1%, if you want to make a 1% move, there's many ways how that can be done. So how do we then hold leadership accountable in respective organizations to ensure that diversity takes place, especially if we keep saying that it's something that we value?
One of the most valuable things that I've seen in American society is the Rooney Rule in the NFL, which is that when a coaching opportunity is created, they have a requirement that a minority person be interviewed for that position. That's the only case I know of in American society, corporations, the government or otherwise, where that exists. But it's the kind of thing, or variations on it, that I think we'll have to be doing as a society to make sure that full consideration is given when opportunities are there, and the matter is considered, thought through, and a decision is made. Just an example of one kind of device that's been used.
Let me hit that one right away, because we don't necessarily have, in the NBA, we don't necessarily have a Rooney Rule like the NFL. However, in terms of looking at Adam's direct leadership team, we've got a large proponent of the leadership team that is minority and or gender diversity. And it's not just about the diversity itself, because that's being invited to the party. It's actually about the inclusion too. We often want to bring that in terms of being able to dance when you're at the party. And so starting at the top, tone at the top, I mentioned it earlier, as our commissioner / CEO, he sets that tone at the top and then it matriculates throughout the organization to our teams, et cetera. And so even like a Cent Marshall, who's now come in to be president of the Dallas Mavericks, working alongside Mark Cuban, those are the things that we want to do by demonstration and example that sets the tone globally for our organization.
Accountability is really key, and most companies, as you said, would not tolerate a lack of change in revenues or business performance quarter to quarter or year to year, and continue to keep that person as a leader. Okay, so if you don't deliver, you lose your job. But yet, when you don't deliver against diversity and inclusion targets, goals, etc., lots of excuses are made on your behalf, and all your excuses are given credence. So when that stops, when diversity and inclusion, whether it is looking at recruitment rates, promotion rates, the way people are coming into and experiencing your organization, if that is not part of the accountability matrix for every direct report to the CEO and for the CEO to the board, then you can continue to expect status quo. But there are some shining great examples. Look at what Intel did, for example, setting real targets and goals around their minority recruiting, retention, and promotion. And they got to their target 2 years ahead of goal, Intel Corporation. Another one is when you really look at Mark Benioff at Salesforce and what he is doing and how he is holding not just internally his organization accountable, but externally speaking about it and holding other CEOs accountable. You look at what Microsoft has done, most recently as it relates to people with disabilities and inclusion for people with disabilities. So when there is a CEO who steps up, who makes that part of their
important key framework and deliverables. And they actually hold their direct reports and their organization accountable. You see change. So now it is, incumbent on the other CEOs to follow suit. And very often I would challenge the boards to say to the CEOs, what are you doing? How are you doing it? How are you holding them accountable? And then that'll cascade down.
One more quick thing, because to your point, Subha, it has to be intentional, no doubt. That's on the top. But then you also ask the question, like, what can we do personally? And so I know I've benefited from a lot of role models that look like me and didn't look like me. So you really have to take it personal as well, and sort of take it on your own to do those things too, both mentoring, sponsorship, all those things. Absolutely.
I just want to add one thing, Henry. You mentioned targets, let's call it, and I think that is setting clear objectives is very important. But I also think it obviously, I'm sure you would agree, goes beyond that. And I'll just give you an example from my own experience. When I was leading the conference board, my senior management team was 50% female, 20% people of color, and about probably 5 or 6 years ago, all of the women, there were 10 people, all 5 of them asked to meet with me. And they sat down and said, we think you're treating us differently than you're treating the men. And I was shocked, and I was also a little angry initially. There's a cartoon, there's a great New Yorker cartoon where a senior management team is sitting around the table, and the chairman, who's a man, or the CEO is a man, says, to the woman, Susan, that's an excellent point. Would one of the men like to make it? And that's in effect what my team suggested I was doing, but not quite so overtly. And after I thought about it, they were basically right. And so I think in that case it took to hold, on the numbers, my board was looking at me and saying, well, you have a diverse team. But it took some real courage on their part, and I hate to put some of the responsibility back on people in the organization to hold leadership accountable. But it took, I think, real courage for this group of people to confront me. I did it very professionally, and it had a desired result. I changed the way I behaved as a result of it. So I think I think targets and objectives are important, but so is a desire to move the chess piece or a willingness to take some rest.
Well, John, that recently happened at Nike, where the senior women stepped up, got their own research, and went to their senior leadership with the data to say, look at what you're doing. There's power and strength in numbers.
Right, I think that's an important lesson.
And Jonathan, let me just say, I am associated now as chairman of the executive committee and a principal and an owner, one-third owner of a firm called Siebert, Cisneros, Shank, which is, for 19 of the last 20 years, been the top performing minority municipal bond underwriting firm in the country on Wall Street, led by an African-American woman named Suzanne Shank, who is a stellar leader technically as well as just all of the leadership attributes. And I have never been in a setting before where a company walked the walk. I mean, they will search, they will wait, they will find in the best universities in the country the kind of talent that makes it technically superior as well as just as diverse as you could possibly imagine in every respect. Women, Asians, Latinos, it's the only firm of its kind with that particular profile. Now, what I'm saying is, perhaps one of the last bastions of change is the financial sector. And this firm has found a way to say, well, if the financial sector is not going to change, we're going to create a firm that walks the walk and create change that way. And there's others of women-owned firms, veterans-owned firms, et cetera, now in the business. And government then says, we want to give people an opportunity. So entrepreneurship, small business, is one of the routes by which we're going to create greater diversity if the big corporations won't change.
Very interesting. All right. Well, we're down to the last couple of minutes. So briefly, I guess I would just ask the generic question about advice. And we talked a little bit about the qualities of leadership that you each look for in candidates, minority candidates or all candidates. But here I'd like you to talk about advice for people entering, the youngest people, not people who are already leaders or on their way. Someone who is a member of the new minority, is just starting their first job, confronting an environment where, where they're in the minority. Is there one piece of advice that you'd each want to give them as they enter into the business world, or into the world of their organization, whatever that is? Tony, go ahead.
Sure, very
I'll just go
briefly.
down.
Don't let the external world define who you are.
Okay.
Be as technically proficient as you possibly can, taking every opportunity, because the rules of the game are not going to change in terms of competence, and they shouldn't, in terms of competence and productivity. But nurture that side, which also understands the larger society, reaches out to other people. It'll make you a better person and a more valuable asset to the entity in the long run.
I would say in your personal life and in your professional life, build your posse. Build a network of supporters and friends that you can lean on when you run into trouble. I didn't say if, I said when you run into trouble, because you will. But if you have a posse, if you have a group to lean back on, they will nurture you and support you, and you will have to do the same for them. So do that in your personal life, do that in your professional life. And as a group or as individuals, find mentors early. Again, both in your careers as well as in your personal life.
6 P's, proper planning and preparation promotes peak performance. So perform, 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 and while you're doing that, create those relationships that really matter.
Fantastic. Well, this is, I've done this a lot of times before. This is as good as it gets. So would you please join me in thanking this incredible panel?